hear from a joint project from 3 of our colleagues, Jen, Marshall, and Yorit. We'll be talking about,
but I'll introduce them.
you'll introduce everyone. We'll be talking about their joint project on public narrative. Before we get started, as we have been doing this entire academic year, we're just going to go around the room very quickly, please, because we have such a big crowd today. We're just going to only say our names, just to introduce ourselves to each other, and then we'll turn the floor over to our colleagues. We'll have until 1 p.m. sharp. All right, thank you. Get started over here.
I'm Matthias Husser.
Mariana Hoyer.
Kathleen Hahn.
Frank Hartman. Ryan Mandel.
Kim Leary.
Chris Mitchell.
Nancy Gibbs.
David Elwood.
Janina Marazeski.
Cornell Wade Brooks.
Ron Brooks.
Al Trula.
Grant Wentworth.
Mark Fagan.
Deborah Isles.
Scott Murray. Bill Hogan.
Ronnie Heifetz.
Quentin Maine. York Miguel.
Marshall Packer.
Jen Lerner.
David Eves.
Julia Minson.
Andrew Roderick.
Jane Entry.
Gordon Ward.
Tommy Shan.
Gladys Native.
Chelsea Sable. Thank you so much for coming. I know this is a really busy time of year. We're all pretty frantic, trying to finish grading, etc. And this talk was supposed to actually be 2 weeks ago. I had a death in my family and we had to reschedule it. So we added this week, and I really appreciate, all of us on the team really appreciate that you made time to come today. So we have a fairly unusual presentation for you because it is very much a team collaboration. And we're calling it Public Narrative, How the Story of Self Becomes the Story of Us and the Story of Now. And if those words don't already mean something to you, if you're not familiar with the public narrative approach, they will, by the end of this talk, mean quite a bit, hopefully. So for today's agenda, I'm first going to introduce our team members and our project objectives. Then Marshall is going to give a brief introduction to the public narrative approach in terms of its conceptualization and, most importantly, of its pedagogical practice. Then I will walk us through some of the research questions that we've been addressing and accompanying studies. In particular, we're going to talk about, are there pre to post changes that are both systematic and statistically significant in how people learn, understand, and practice public narrative? Is there an underlying mathematical structure that organizes such changes and a structure that's stable across different samples? What mechanisms drive the changes that we see in public narrative? An important question that we don't often get to look at in studies of an educational practice are, can we make causal inferences? And a scale that is strong enough psychometrically to be used across populations. And then Yorit is going to walk us through some implications and future directions. I want to tell you something about the team that worked on this, and I really should say is working on this. This is our first presentation of the work. We are by no means done. We have enough that we can show you some meaningful results, but we are by no means complete. So the project started out across the street at Tanjore, and which, as you know, is the site of many, we call it what, Kennedy School East. And Marshall and I were having lunch, and we were talking about this practice of public narrative that he teaches, and he asked me, sort of as a favor, would I just look at some of the data? This was several years ago. And so I said, okay, I'll just look at some of the data. And I thought, you know, this is like a couple hours work. And then I'll be done. And so I started looking at the data and discovered that it was really interesting. So I then brought in a doctoral student on the team, Charlie Dorison, who unfortunately with the rescheduled date is out of town today, and also a research fellow in my group, Chelsea Zabel, who is in the back, and she is serving as our timer. Once we started really discovering that there was a there, we talked to Joran about the project, and he said, hey, you know what, we could do this with real leaders too. Let's bring in the Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative and study mayors. And then we said, okay, we're for real. We're going to bring in also a personality psychologist who has studied from a scholarly academic perspective public narrative, not public narrative, but the development of self-narrative and life story. And so Jen Wilkendahl is a personality psychologist at Haverford College who has published extensively in personality psychology, and we brought in Dana Bourne, who also brings extensive experience in the practice of leadership and pedagogy. So this is the team of collaborators, and again, because of the date change, not everyone could be here. We are filming this, so make sure you say eloquent comments. They will be recorded, and this way, others who couldn't be here. And there is a seat right up here, and also one next to Deb. Oh, 2 seats, yeah, plenty of seats. Okay, I want to also say that this project is so large and complex, involving lab and field studies. We've benefited from a wonderful administrative team. So Clara Kavanian is our organizer. She organizes all of our meetings. Warren Dent and David Markley work on the Bloomberg project. And Joe Kim is now a PhD student at Penn, but was originally a research assistant on the project. That's the team. So this project, as you can see already, is quite unusual because it's 4 faculty from within the Kennedy School all working together, and we are not used to working together. So I am a decision scientist, not a personality psychologist, and so I'm kind of taking a lot of the tools that I learned in graduate school and applying them here because the project is so fascinating. Normally I do laboratory and field experiments, not this kind of work. And so we are all working at, if you think about a Venn diagram, at the collective synergy. We're also working at the synergy among research, pedagogy, and practice. So all 3 of these are equally important in this particular project. And we think that this is really a project that speaks to the enormous potential of when our faculty tries to work as more than the sum of our parts. Okay. In some ways, I hope that you will think of this as timely work so Pete Buttigieg, former president of the IOP here, and Brian Stevenson, one of our graduates, both important leaders who very explicitly invoke public narrative in their work. In fact, Mayor Pete was in workshops with Marshall, and we're not showing his data, but his work is very closely related. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marshall to give some background on conceptualization.
Thanks. Thank you, Jen and Jordan, everybody who's been involved in this project. With this introduction, I'm going to speak fast because I'm going to introduce public narrative as a leadership practice, share why it seems to work the way it does, and then how to link the teaching, research, and practice in what I call pedagogy of practice, or teaching leadership by practicing. I gotta do this. There, okay. First, something on leadership. The approach I take to leadership is rooted in 3 questions posed by this first-century Jerusalem scholar, Rabbi Hillel, who, when asked, how do I figure out what to do with my life, responded with 3 questions. To ask yourself, first, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? Not a selfish question, but a self-regarding question. A question about self-awareness and self-understanding. The second question, he says, ask yourself, if I am for myself alone, whatever. Because to be a who and not a what is to recognize the inherent relationality of our experience as human beings. And finally, he says, ask yourself, if not now, when? Not advice to jump into moving traffic, but certainly a caution against what Jay Mammon calls error preparation. Just more planning and planning will be ready. The point is that rarely can we learn to do well what we want to do without actually beginning to do it. And the understanding, that understanding flows from practice, not preceding, from action and not preceding. And so for me, leadership is about the interaction of self, us, and now. Self, relationship, and action, and how they work together. Now, the fact that there are questions is also important. Because if you consider what the real domain of leadership is, rarely when everything's going great, everything's functioning fine, and rarely do you hear, where's the leadership so we can thank them? When you hear, who's in charge here, what's happening? There's problems, there's challenges. What it suggests is that the inherent domain of the adaptive skill of leadership is in dealing with the unexpected, the contradictory, the dilemma that requires an adaptive response. And accepting that can be very challenging. You ask yourself, do I have the skills I need to deal with these new things? A challenge to the hands. Can I use my resources in new ways to accomplish my purposes, which is a strategic challenge, a challenge to the head. And then there's, where do I get the courage? Where do I get the hope? How do I inspire the hope and courage in others to take the risks that are often involved in meeting real challenges? And that's a challenge to the heart. So it's thinking of leadership in a head, hands, heart kind of way. Now, so the definition that I've come to use is there. That it's about a choice to accept responsibility for enabling others to achieve shared purpose under conditions of uncertainty. So this is not a diva concept of leadership. It's leadership about enabling the accomplishment of shared purpose and outcome. Now, what does narrative have to do with this? Well, narrative is fundamentally about agency. But like values, it communicates through the language of emotion, like music, like literature, like worship. As such, it can both instruct and enable. We use it, we call on narrative to access the emotional resources embedded in our values to respond to disruptions with intentionality as opposed to reacting to them with fear. In other words, it is a way of creating the emotional conditions for the exercise of agency. Now, all stories have a plot, a character, and a moral. The core unit of narrative is the narrative moment. It is a moment in which a protagonist confronts a challenge, a response is required, and there is an outcome that results from that. A challenge, a choice, and an outcome. And it turns out that we can use narrative to turn threats that inspire fear into challenges that invite engagement. So it's now the narrative moment. Just if you want to see what narrative moment is, watch 6 minutes of Michelle Obama and 6 minutes of Hillary Clinton at the Democratic Convention. Michelle Obama speaks all in narrative moments, which means past is present. She's bringing us there. We can see it, we experience it, and therefore we get the emotional content of the meaning. as well as we get the person. Hillary could never do that. The walls were too great. And so it's just a very striking illustration of the power of narrative. Now, because we can identify with because we can identify with the protagonist, we understand that works out through mirror neurons, we can experience the emotional content of the moment on the one hand, of the moment. We can experience the sense of urgency. We can experience perhaps the anger. On the other hand, we may experience the hope. We may experience, in the face of isolation, solidarity. We may experience, in the sense of self-doubt, a sense of self-worth. What it means is that we can experience the values, or what Charles Taylor called the moral sources, in which their response is rooted, not only as ideas, but as lived experience. And that's what's crucial about this. So the moral that we take away,
What is blessing?
and I'm sorry, you can make a difference. And it's you can make a difference. It's not somebody can make a difference. It's you in particular can make a difference. And the moral we take away then is less to the head than to the heart. As such, it becomes a part of our own experience we can draw upon when we face disruptions for which we're not prepared. The movies sold out of tickets, or a marriage breaks up. I mean, from big to small, part of the core element of human consciousness is having to cope with the unexpected, having to that for which we are not prepared, but having to do it. Now, it turns out that we have within our own lives a repertoire of these moments, a repertoire of moments of hurt, when we learned what we care about, and moments of hope when we found that we developed the belief that we could actually do something about them. And those moments can be called on both for ourselves when confronting disruption and enabling others to find those moments in their lives with which they can do that. Now, this is why faith traditions, cultures, institutions, cultures all teach through narrative. We hear our first stories from our parents. Partly to keep us busy, of course, but Jerome Bruner found that 85% of the time parents spend with young children is in storytelling. And if you say, well, why? Most people will say, well, I want to teach them. I want to teach them something. Well, why don't you just give them a list of rules and say, follow the rules? It doesn't work. It turns out the experiential content of choice making, rooted in values, is what the child takes from it and what all of us take from it. Now, public narrative is a way, it's a way of, we can harness the power of narrative to the work of leadership. We can, first of all, learn to access narrative moments in our own lives to communicate to others why we care, where we learn to care, where we get our hope. We call that a story of self. It's not a resume. It's not a list of our accomplishments. It is an account of the experiential source of what we care about and where we get our hope. We can draw on moments of narrative experience shared by others to tell what we call the story of us. And we can turn the current moment into a narrative moment by evoking the urgency of the moment, by finding a source of hope in the moment, and then articulating the choices we have to make in this moment to address the challenge. The first time I taught this class, somebody said, oh, I see, this is how we can brand ourselves, this is how we can market ourselves. Jayanti Ravi, who was from India, she said, no, this is not about how to apply a gloss from the outside, it's how to bring out the glow from the inside. The premise is that authenticity requires just as much skill as vigor, if not more. Now, what's the pedagogy of practice? I'll take just a moment more here. To quote a great philosopher, Daenerys Targaryen, said that no one has ever learned to ride a dragon without riding a dragon. A less challenging metaphor is that of learning to ride a bike. You know what you have to do to learn to ride a bike. You have to get on it. you got to get on, you got to fail, you got to learn from your failure, and in that way you master the practice. That's inherent to the pedagogy that we use. Now, the development of that pedagogy came in several ways. First, I grew up in a culture in which identity was much more rooted in narrative than in place. That's a lot of what the Jewish tradition is all about. The movements I was involved in all told stories. In fact, we learned that in order to have a campaign, we had to have a story, why we're doing what we're doing, a strategy, how we're going to do it, and a structure, how we could organize ourselves to do it. So when I finished my dissertation on strategy, I wanted to dive into narrative and figure out that motivation side, which was so important. So I wound up immersing myself in sociology, psychology, literature, religion, but so many different fields deal with narrative to try to get at what the common thread was and how it's built. Now, in developing a module to teach here, which thanks to Derek Bach and Mark Moore, I committed to do, and I'm really grateful for that. I had to deal with, okay, how do we turn this into something actionable, something that can be learned? And it was particularly valuable here because of the wide diversity of our students in almost every way. So you couldn't be culturally specific. You had to be able to cross those boundaries. Then at the same time, we put it into practice. First in a project we were doing with the Sierra Club on how to revive their local groups. Then with Camp Obama, with the Obama campaign, where we had an opportunity to test this to scale. And actually, between 2007 and 2016, my former students, coaches, trainers, and collaborators had conducted 448 workshops in which 32,184 people participated in some 25 countries, including Denmark, Serbia, Jordan, India, Japan, Mexico, and China. And in domains as distinct as healthcare, education, politics, religion, advocacy, and in collaboration with mayors, with 80 mayors in the last time. So it's generated from these different sources. Now, the essence of it is reflective practice. And this was just to show some of the different cultures in which we've done public narrative work. You can see the multiplicity of different languages in which people do that. So, there's the bicycle. For that. Pedagogical development, well, I covered that. Research, teaching, and practice. Okay. So, the approach we take is well, first of all, it's reflective practice. Explain the theory, practice it, debrief that. It's explain, model the practice, practice it, and then debrief it. It's sort of a sequence of 4 different dimensions of learning experience. Practice, as we teach it, involves both concept and values and skills. So it's head, hands, heart. It's not just like do this skill. It's why does that skill work? Why does it matter? Students learn not only to tell their own story, but how to coach others in telling theirs. And we teach narrative as a craft based on learning to do explicitly something that many of us already know how to do implicitly, which is tell stories. We're all hardwired for this, and so bringing craft to it is what we're trying to do. Now, to do that, we create a brave learning space. I'll just another minute here. Not a safe learning space, but a brave learning space. By asking students to agree on shared norms as well as norm corrections that can support the development of a growth mindset as opposed to fixed mindset, risk-taking, vulnerability, and mutual support. And then finally, iterative, interactive learning, finally. We begin this class with a full-day workshop in which everyone is taken through Self, Us, Now experientially. It's sort of David Perkins' idea of the whole game. Introduce people to the whole so that then they can unpack the parts as we move through. We alternate between class lecture and discussion, and Tuesday sections of 20 led by teaching fellows we've trained in coaching, facilitation, and evaluation, mostly former students. And students work in teams of 4 with whom they learn to develop their own narrative, present to their classmates, analyze what worked and what didn't. And at the end of each class, we take a few moments for feedback on the day's learning, asking what actually facilitated learning, pluses, what needs to be improved, deltas, and takeaways. So we build continual learning into the whole process. Finally, I think the biggest benefit of having the opportunity to develop this practice here has been this opportunity for collaboration, specifically with Jen. For years, I've thought that we should be learning more from the way we're teaching practice because we can learn about the practice itself by the way we teach it if there's a connection between the two. But when Jen agreed to look at some pre-post surveys we've done, then she and her team began to do her magic. And it was extraordinary what we learned from that. So, Jen, thanks.
Thanks, Marshall. Okay. So, as you heard, in case you weren't already familiar with Marshall's amazing work, this is a practice that has been taught around the world in many different countries. It's been instrumental in many political campaigns, including Obama's first presidential campaign. And there was a conventional wisdom by the practitioners who adopted this and by the students who go on wait lists to get into Marshall's classes that there's something really working here. But we didn't have a kind of rigorous set of empirical analyses, and so that's what we set out to do. And so this is an overview of the studies we've done so far that are publishable. So we have other studies that were kind of pilot studies that are not even on this list. And in order to get it to all fit on one slide, you can see I collapsed 6 studies here into one with 3 studies, 3A through 3F, because there's a tremendous amount of psychometric work that needs to be done to go from this really inductive approach of starting with what's going on in the classroom and then trying to fit it into a scholarly literature and to make it tractable empirically. So to give you a broad overview, what you can see is that some of these studies are with Kennedy School students, some of them are with mayors, a number of them are with MTurk workers, because we're testing things like how well does the underlying mathematical structure hold up across different sample populations. And some of them are in classrooms, some of them in field settings, etc. We have, as you know, a very short time today, so I'm not going to be able to present all of these studies. We also are in the middle of doing 2 more that are not even on this list. But I will highlight a few of them. I'm going to start from the beginning. And we decided to do that, to start from the beginning with a pilot study, because I thought it would be useful for anyone who does want to start to say, how would I really measure what's happening in my classroom? What would the actual beginning point be? And so I am going to start with that pilot approach. And as you can see, already we've run 2,809 participants. So when Marshall first came to me, he already had a set of items that he had written himself, 49 of them, and that he was assessing from pre to post. And these are things that inductively were designed to try to capture what was going on. And so the first thing to see was the change from time 1 to time 2, with the class being the treatment that happens in between. Was that a significant change, statistically significant change? And which items show the change? And then a second goal was to see, is there any kind of organizing conceptual coherence to the items that show a change? Are these kind of random variation, or is there some systematic coherence?
Jen, could you just give an example of what an item is that you're
Absolutely. So here are items. And
Take it ahead.
so it was very funny when Marshall first told me he had 49. 49. Where do you get that number? And but that is what And so of that 49, 17 showed significant change. And so just to read you a sample item here, I understand my own reasons for being passionate about my work. So a lot of the items were extremely problematic. They were what you call double-barreled. They were assessing more than one thing. They had negatives and positives in the same. They were very complicated. They needed a whole lot of refinement. So I don't think Gallup would be adopting them, right? And so that's some of the work that we've been doing over this time. But we did find that 17 showed significant change. By chance, you would find about 2.5 of the 49 would show significant change, just when you're testing with statistical significance. And so this is considerably above chance that there is something happening, something changing. And then I used a technique called factor analysis, which is just a data reduction technique that looks at matrices of variance and covariance and tries to see, are there underlying latent structures that organize what is changing? It happens to be one of my all-time favorite statistical procedures, and so we've been doing lots of them. And what we found is that the change is organized around 2 different constructs. One is a set of items that have to do with a self-perceived ability to motivate others. And again, that is consistent with what Marshall said about not a diva model of leadership. This is not the charismatic leader who's going to do all. This is about enabling others. And then the second construct is about sharing one's story. So over many studies, we refined those items down originally to 13, and then finally the scale that we now have and the one that we hope to publish is a 12-item scale. So that here is what they look like, and this took many studies to get to this final set. The items that have an asterisk are actually the original items. Other items are rewording some of the items that were originally there so that it's easier for participants to understand them. They're written in a more straightforward way. And as many of you know, in the process of scale development, you always want to have some items that are written in a positive way and some that are written in a negative way so that respondents don't get into a response set where they're just saying yes, 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 or 5, 5, 5, 5. You need them to be evaluatively inconsistent. So we added some reverse scored items. Yeah, David?
So some of these, like, I'm reluctant to tell my story in public, but let's just start with the first one. People often want to put me in charge. How does one change one view of that over the course of a course? I used to think they did. I don't think they do now. I never thought they did. I mean, help me understand what we're measuring the change in here.
Yeah. So this is an item that shows a positive change as a result of being in the class. And so people actually come to more strongly endorse that item after they've gone through the public narrative training.
So they changed their view about whether people want them to be in charge.
Yes, exactly. And then I'll show you in a couple studies some of the actual psychological constructs that mediate that effect. Yep. And similarly here, people more strongly endorse, I am good at inspiring others to act. And then they less strongly endorse, I do not want to reveal much about myself to others, because that's a reverse scored item. So those are the constructs, and these are alpha, these are convex alpha
I'm
levels here.
sorry, just to make this very clear for myself.
Yeah.
What they're really saying is, I am now better at getting people to want to put me in charge, or is it I'm more aware of the fact that they always did? I'm just trying to, I'm not trying to be difficult, they feel like what you said, I'm better at inspiring others to act than I used to be as a result of this course. Is that the interpretation?
So the actual response scale that that they use for this is strongly disagree to strongly agree. So empirically, what happens is someone will more strongly agree with the statement. People often want to put me in charge.
Got it. And how long after the course is this asked?
Do they do that because they've become more self-confident and the world is the same? Or have they learned to take charge? So those are two different things, right?
Yeah.
In other words, this is just a psychological change about oneself, or they're learning about how to take charge.
Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, partly is how long after. If you said before I wasn't very good at this, now I'm good at it, or I've always been good at it, I just didn't realize it. That's the kind of distinction I'm trying to draw here.
Jim,
So, do you want to comment on
just
that?
to comment on that, the notion of taking charge is culturally very problematic.
Yep.
And so to acknowledge that people are calling on you to take charge is a cool thing. It's not a bad thing. And so it's a combination of a growth in competence, but it's also sort of rehabilitating the notion of leadership, which is very problematic in a lot of cultural settings. I think that's what's happening. I think
So, to a certain extent, our data don't allow us to nail down something like whether there's a confidence change. I'll show you in the studies we have what exactly we can say from the data. The theory says that there is a confidence change, but what the item specifically says is, I more strongly agree with the statement that people often want to put me in charge. And there is a well-documented self-perception process of change that happens simply from getting up and giving a speech as a leader. And Bem's self-perception theory shows that then when you act out that role, the self-perception follows from the behavior. So the behavior comes first, and then the self-perception changes from it. And when you're up there practicing giving speeches, trying to motivate others, then it naturally follows that you see yourself more in that role. So I'm going to have to ask for clarifying questions only, or I will never be able to show you what we actually have. But we are all prepared to stay till 1:30, and we'll have little time for discussion afterwards. Is this a clarifying question?
It's a question about what's coming, so let's see if it comes and it doesn't
Okay.
pass.
All right. So again, we also think of this as sort of the first of hopefully more presentations because there's so much in here. So that was the pilot study. And well, the first thing we needed to know is, are such changes generalizable? Are they going to happen only among Kennedy School students? Or can they happen with experienced leaders? And is it scalable, this kind of intervention, if you will, this kind of training? Or do you need to be in the classroom for many, many weeks with Marshall? And these are obviously important questions for teaching leadership practice. And so I'll show you a study that addresses this, the Mayer study. And when we first were running this, Chelsea went to New York to run the Mayers. And we were skeptical, really skeptical, because we thought these are elected mayors. Not only are they elected mayors, they're sort of go-getter elected mayors in the Bloomberg program. So they're really up on things, and it's quite possible that there's going to be a ceiling effect. So they already see themselves as leaders. They're already elected. And so maybe there won't be room for growth. Also, it's possible that this factor structure that we saw for all of the items falling into those two factors, and we do explain all of the items on those factors. There's no other miscellaneous items. I should have made that clear. It could be that there's a unique factor structure for experienced leaders versus inexperienced Kennedy School students. The other thing is this, in particular, was a one-day treatment. Marshall can do 2-day treatments, move-on treatments, 6-week treatments. This is a one-day treatment, and so this will never work. But here is what it looks like. So these are mayors, and this is one of the people on the training team. And long story short, it worked. So significant changes from pre to post test, no ceiling effect problem, same latent factor structure held together with reasonably good alpha, Cronbach alphas on the items. So we thought, wow, okay. And this is how the project has continued to go, is that I sort of ahead of time kept thinking this is going to unravel. And it's never unraveled. So in the next study, we wanted to look at could we possibly get some causal leverage. Now, the ideal way to get causal leverage is to randomly assign people to a treatment versus control group. And we are in discussions about doing that with mayors. But as you can imagine, very hard to get mayors into a control group. And so there's a lot to figure out there. And imagine trying to put Harvard students into the control group. They would not be very happy with that. So we decided that we could design a quasi-experiment. And so many of our Kennedy School colleagues volunteered to administer pre and post tests to their students. And which is a very conservative test because most of the Kennedy School students are all here engaging in some sort of leadership development practice. And so to be able to show, which is what we set out to show, that the students who are in the public narrative class show significantly greater increases on the motivation scale and the sharing scale is a tough test. But study 2, we set out to do that, and we also set out to try to identify the mechanisms. Now, there are a lot of possible mechanisms, and Marshall outlined a number of them, in particular some of the emotional changes that may be happening. What we sought to do first was to try to link to some of the most important, well-conceptualized, well-documented personality measures in the academic personality psychology field. And so we measured a concept called self-concept clarity, which has been used in hundreds of studies, really good scale. And here, the definition is a little bit hard to read. It's the extent to which self-beliefs are clearly and confidently defined, internally consistent and stable. So this is a do I know who I am kind of scale. And then we also wanted to measure non-clinical narcissism because we had this latent fear that maybe we were creating a bunch of narcissists. and so people who are really good at making all kinds of promises, and I am going to do this and do that, and people want to put me in charge. And so there's a clinical level of narcissism, but we use the non-clinical, which is defined here as grandiose yet fragile sense of self and entitlement, as well as a preoccupation with success and demands for admiration. So, we can't think of anybody like that. So we were, we decided we might as well measure this right up front and see if we're creating monsters. And so here we used a treatment group, 121 students at pre and post, taking the public narrative class, and then the control sample. So we had 114. You can see that both in the treatment and in the control, we had some attrition for the end of semester, but still, and significantly greater attrition here. We think, however, that this makes for a conservative test because the people who did stay in for doing the survey at time 2 in the control group are probably the better students, who are the more conscientious students, and so they're the ones that end up in our sample. They would be the ones that were also more likely to be potentially So we had the same scale items as before. And quick summary of the results, we did this difference of differences analysis. In other words, asking, was the change from time 1 to time 2 on the motivation scale and the sharing scale significantly greater if you had a public narrative class than if you took another class at the Kennedy School? And in fact, they were. And we did that analysis. I like to do analyses 4 different ways for any given question like that. And it comes out. And importantly, we wanted to look at the mediational mechanisms. So here is a path model where TVC stands for the treatment versus control group, and we're predicting the outcome of motivation. The motivation subscale here. This is narcissism and self-concept clarity. I'm sorry, those numbers did not come out well on the slide, but what you can see here is that in predicting motivation, there are significant paths from treatment versus control group through self-concept clarity and non-significant paths through narcissism. So that was a big phew. And then if you look for sharing, it is similar. We are better able at predicting sharing. Here you can see the beta weight is 0.39. It's stronger, whoops, than in the motivation model, which is only 0.18. But nonetheless, we now have a connection to a concept that's already in the literature, and so it allows us to bring this inductively created from practice set of items and relate it to some of the existing academic literature. Then examining the psychometric properties, the scales held up, and they were good but not great. So we then set out to do lots and lots of psychometric studies. And so we needed to see how do we refine the measures so that they hold together better. We wanted to see whether these scales are significantly different than the most widely used personality scale in the literature, which is the Big Five. You're probably familiar with it. We also needed to assess reliability over time. So we've done studies, for example, where we measure the same set of people who haven't had an intervention at one point and then at another point 1 week later to see whether they are reasonably stable if there's no intervention, and they are. We've also done a study 4 weeks later, and those data we have not yet analyzed. They're out to be looked at. We've done a bunch of studies on convergent and divergent validity. In other words, does this new scale predict things you would expect it to? Does it correlate in the ways it should? And is it different in the ways it should be? I'm going to go just glossing over those quickly. Here you can see some of the Big Five measures and some of the correlations. No correlations are above 0.5. Here's a replication in another class Marshall taught of pre to post changes for the motivation subscale and the sharing subscale. And so the results have now replicated quite a few times. Jumping way ahead to studies 6 and 7, we're starting to look at, it's really important for us to know, in all of those prior studies, these are self-reports, essentially predicting self-reports. We need to know, does self-report predict actual behavior? And so we have a whole set of studies on that. So for example, in study 6, we're looking at the predicted validity of the sharing subscale. And here we did a choice task where with an online sample, we had them take the scale, and then in a choice task, they could respond in one of several different formats. And one is they have to give examples from their own personal life. Another, they have to give examples from popular news, a whole variety of different choices that vary in terms of how much they would involve self-disclosure. We also set out to do one on validity for the motivation subscale. Here, well, actually, let me turn to some results on that. So on the self-disclosure, they could write a personal story or an impersonal story, and we predicted that their sharing subscale would predict their choice, and in fact it does. And then for the motivation subscale, we have lots of videos of people doing their public narratives, and so we can actually pair people who are high on the motivation scale and low on the motivation scale, and then have respondents watch these videos and rate their perceptions of them. So in this one, they rated the speaker on the public narrative scale items and their perceived leadership ability. And the scores on, and so seeing the high versus the low person, it strongly predicts observers' prediction of how well they can motivate others. Okay. A study that we are about to do is following this same prototype approach where we have people who are high on the scale versus low on the scale. We're going to combine the motivation and the sharing subscales into one public leadership scale for this. And then we're going to have a very large number of observers watching these public narratives and rating public leadership ability. And ultimately, what we are hypothesizing and hoping for is that the people who have scored high on this motivation subscale and the sharing subscale will be viewed as having greater leadership capability. So, real quickly, I have 1 minute left. In terms of implications, future directions, within the academic field of personality psychology, and these implications are very much with input from Jen Lildendahl, who is an expert in adult development and the development of self-stories. What the field has mostly concentrated so far on is, and it's very well established, literature, Adams and McLean is one of the most highly cited papers, is how having a coherent self-story predicts individual well-being, and it also predicts the ability to develop positive meaning from life's challenges. These are very intrapsychic kinds of concepts. So what the literature on self-narrative and life story has not done at all is look at what is the impact of that on an applied societal level. And that is where our work comes in and hopefully is going to extend existing personality literature so that we're looking at the value of sharing one's life story, connecting it to the story of others, and connecting it to a concrete purpose. So what we understand from people working within that literature is that this will hopefully be a theoretical advance in the kind of basic personality field. And then, of course, future research is to integrate these fields. What has heretofore been really disconnected, the leadership literature has been pretty disconnected from the academic field of personality psychology. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jorrit, who's going to extend that to implications and future directions for pedagogy and practice.
Thanks, Jen. So my research and teaching focus on strategy, leadership, and innovation in the public sector, and I'm the faculty director of the Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative, and we've been working with 80 mayors and their senior leadership teams so far, and we'll have another 80 in the next 2 years. And when we were putting together this program, the big question was, what are we hoping to accomplish? What does success look like? Because if you take a mayor out of their city, you better really add value. And so I remember vividly when Deb Miles and I put together the proposal the donor had asked us, like, well, it sounds good leadership, but how do you know this really works? And we're like, that's a fair question. We teach how to use data and evidence in cities, so shouldn't we do that ourselves? And we had to come back and say, like, well, we got participant evaluations, and they all like our programs. But how do we know that actual impacting practice is occurring as a result of our interventions? And so when I met with Marshall and Jen, to discuss, the mayor's part of this research program, we were hoping to develop, an approach, a methodology to assess the impact. But we also, in the process of developing a tailor-made conception of public leadership that would actually be helpful to our mayors. And we, talking about putting people in charge and elected officials, they have been put in charge by the electorate, but turns out that when you work with mayors, they say unanimously that most of their work is not leading with formal authority. Most of their work is leading without formal authority because they have limited resources and limited ability to actually tell people what to do. So for their success, they depend on successfully engaging the private sector, the nonprofit sector, citizens, but even their own frontline employees. And so public narrative as a way of engaging others, mobilizing others, is key to the leadership that mayors exercise or attempt to exercise. So I think the implications of this work, and it's been a real pleasure working with Jen and the other Jen Lilgendahl and Dana and Marshall and Chelsea and Charlie, is, we've learned a lot and we can immediately apply this. The conceptual contribution is we now have a very consistent and intentional approach to leadership development for the mayor's program, and it's worked really well. The mayors asked for this. Pete Buttigieg was part of our first cohort. He invited Marshall's team to South Bend, Indiana, and he became a coach in the public narrative workshop for community leaders. So there's a ripple effect that's a lot wider. The methodological contribution is super helpful because we actually want to tell mayors, yeah, this is not just a wonderful, enjoyable experience, some kind of junket. No, this is actually going to help you in making progress. This is not, as you said, like a diva conception of leadership, navel gazing. It is actually going to help you make progress and be more effective in what you do. So we can convince mayors that this is good use of their time. And the practical implications are also important. Rigorous program evaluation is now possible because we have those skills and we have the methods to actually see the delta. But also we can tell our donor, like they ask us, like, what evidence do you have till we get back to them? This is collaboration with the business school. The business school was very, so like, why are you asking this question? Why would people spend their money if it didn't provide any value? Like, okay, that's one answer. Maybe Mike Bloomberg will, that will resonate with him. But we said, well, we have to do better. So Deb Isles and I have been putting together this whole impact assessment framework, and this immediately helps. Also convince the donor that this is a good use of the mayor's time and a good use of the funder dollars. With that, back over to Jen.
So, we want to wrap up on what we think is the meta impact of this work, and which is something that we're hoping that actually all of us can do more of, which is explore the synergies among research, pedagogy, and practice, and learn in bi-directional and cross-directional ways among them. We want to thank our funding sources, CPL and Bloomberg, have been helpful for this. And we really want to thank all of you for taking time on this busy day to come, and we are hoping that since we'll be working on this for a while, you will share your comments, questions, feedback, etc. with us. And with that, I'll close, and then anyone who needs to leave can do so, and then we'll take more questions and comments. So.
I wonder if the next step would be
said.
People who
That's what I'm
scored
saying.
high.
I thought it was,
Yes.
3 weeks ago.
Perfect. Great. Just not far looking for. Thank you.
I got it, thank you.
So Jenny's asking, is the next step seeing whether people who score high on motivation actually can motivate others? So in the study that we ran, that I reported, it's the self-perception of whether they can, but we haven't been able to yet test exactly what you were saying, which is, do they then go on to do something? We would love to test that. And
And it
that
seems
is
to
a
me you
natural
could test it
step.
in a lab. I was wondering, Marshall, it's
Sorry.
just okay to interrupt. At one point you said that you had the students give a public narrative, and then you analyzed what worked and what didn't work. And I wonder if you could just expand a little on the concept of what worked. You mean actually got someone in the audience to do something they would otherwise not do? Or just the audience thought, oh, that's kind of seems persuasive to me?
Well, in the context of the class, it's what didn't work in terms of what facilitated
Marshall,
your
just a
learning.
little louder.
Okay.
Facilitated your learning?
What facilitated your learning? What do we do that facilitated your learning? What experience was it? One of the things that ranks highest is coaching, because we start off the class by teaching how to coach, because that's fundamental to the idea of leadership, of enabling others, not just giving orders to others. And they learn through a process of peer coaching that teaching fellow is working and is doing. So that turns out to be a very important part of the pedagogy. The models, the getting on the bike and falling off, and then having to fix it. But you fix it by learning from your peers and from the reaction. Well, this worked. This didn't work. In other words, and the work is my experience of what you're doing. Do I get you? You know, it's like, do I get you? Is this moving me? Do I understand this? Do I feel part of the us that you're trying to create? And do I experience the urgency in what you're calling on me to do? Is there hope here? So it's the way listeners respond to what's happening, and then they incorporate that, and then adapt and so forth on the basis of doing that. We do the same thing in workshops in other places too. I mean, I guess one of the criteria, every time we do workshops like this, there's people that want to teach it. And so we train coaches and we train trainers all the time because there's people who want to teach it, which is kind of evidence of its effectiveness.
The evidence I want to see is that when you try to motivate people, they actually get motivated and
Yeah.
act in a way that they would not otherwise have acted.
Yeah, so I love the idea that you're saying we could do that in a lab. What would you want to see them do?
Do something they would otherwise not have done. In other words, something that's unattractive, something that they would not otherwise have done. Julia.
Chelsea, can you take notes on these things?
I think I have a research design for Jenny's question.
Great.
So if you have had this work on MTurk, can you get people to deliver a narrative in support of a particular cause and have viewers donate money to the cause, donate part of their MTurk pay to the cause?
Uh-huh. Oh, that is interesting.
We have another proxy, which is specifically for the mayors. We've been looking at the State of the City address, which always happens in January. It's like a State of the Union for the city. And looking for the approval ratings and the perception of those speeches. So it's not a perfect measurement of would they act differently, but at least their perception of the mayoral leadership can be measured. So over time, we can actually see with our cohorts if there's a correlation with that too.
The other, if we had the data to capture, is in all this practice out there in the world, people are using this. Like, say, traditional women in Shabbat Aviv in Jordan find a sense of self that enables them to take another step and go on a campaign to try to create safe homes in their beginning. There's so much of that. It's anecdotal, but there's so much of this sort of change in self-concept as being, I am somebody, and I'm capable. And that's where a lot of the action comes from. And then listeners respond to that as well as the other dynamics. The other thing is we have a second half of the class where we focus specifically on how to use narrative to deal with loss, to deal with difference, to deal with change, to deal with sort of takes it to a more strategic way, but we haven't been able to analyze that.
So I think we can make progress on this, Jenny Julia suggestion. That's not easy to do because we have to then put people through the treatment versus the control and then have them in a situation where they can do that. But we've got that design noted. Yeah.
So I have a question regarding the timing of the post-test, because I myself was a treatment, I treated by Marshall a few years ago when you gave a class on for the resistance school, a bunch of students. It was very, inspiring, and I remember leaving the space with lots of emotions, motivations, and I think, for a few days, if you asked me a bunch of questions, I would probably respond in some ways, and now 2 years later, I'm not so sure if I would respond.
We have to revisit this, clearly.
Yes, I have to watch again. But what is the timing of your post-test? Does it take place right after your class, or 6 months after your class, a year after class? So what is the time frame?
So it differs depending on the study. In classroom studies, we give them a window, and it's sort of a when they get around to it, turning it in. And so it could be, I'd have to look. Chelsea, do you remember how wide our window is?
Only like a week or so.
Uh-huh.
I have.
So we can start to look over time, and one of the things, all of these studies are the changes systematic, reliable, theoretically, conceptually coherent, but all of these kinds of questions, like how good is the half-life of the effect, are things that we haven't yet begun to look at, but now can. So do you want to note looking at decay rates? Yeah.
I have a question about the narrative part of it in gender, and I apologize, Marshall, if you addressed this in your course, but I feel like that particularly in public life for politicians, there's a narrower band that women walk in terms of the stories they tell and the personalities they portray in terms of confidence versus sympathetic natures. Does that play into how women use narrative, particularly when they're women who have already done a lot and they're not a fresh face?
We did a really interesting workshop just a few weeks ago with the Vital Voices group, which are women leaders from about 17 countries. And we did, the first day was a full Self Us Now workshop. The second day was how to coach others. It was like a transformational moment for them. And these were from, mostly from the Middle East, from Africa, from South Asia, where most people are from. And it created an enormous sisterhood within who was there. It was very strong body. But then, they say, I'm always trying to do the data thing. And so I'm letting go of my experience, which is actually the most valuable thing to me in why I'm doing and in communicating. So clearly what you named is a real thing. And again, that's the Michelle Obama-Hillary contrast.
But do you have a public leader who's done a lot, who's a woman, who has done well on the narrative front? I feel like Michelle Obama, I personally adore her, but she hasn't run, she's run hospital networks, which is different, but she's not running on her ability to be a hospital administrator. Does the narrative approach, is there somebody because a lot of the examples I think of are males.
Well, we can get from the med school, the School of Public Health, out of there. We do with the Washington, the fellowship program. In fact, they're doing public narrative training for first-year residents here now at a bunch of the hospitals. And that's a gender mix, and it's also ethnic mix. Generally, as a rule, the participants tend to be maybe 60% women.
Yeah, no, I can see that people be excited about it and see it applied, and I just wonder if you have a seminal example in public life of a woman for whom this has worked.
What I can tell you from the data is that there are certain things where female will score higher or lower than males, but none of the relationships are statistically moderated by gender. And so all of, and we tested also they hold in the same direction and significance level for males and females. But you could ask the same question you're asking for more individualistic versus collectivistic cultures.
Sure.
And which is another way of framing yours. And you'll expect to find differences. Certainly self-concept parity is much stronger in individualistic cultures. And I think what you might be saying is that men are more free to assert that self-concept, parity, individualistic, this is who I am, whereas as women have to define themselves more communally. So yes, you will find some of those fluctuations, but the main pattern of the findings does not differ by males and females.
Just the other thing to add, the second variable about sharing, it's really about vulnerability. It's allowing yourself to be seen, to be vulnerable. And men are really resistant to that, big time. And it often takes a lot of work, whereas they're less resistant to that.
Yeah, you can put me in it for a while.
Sure. My question really went to earlier point about assessing perception of leadership. So namely, you can have leaders who perceive themselves as being better leaders. Since you're looking at both mayors and chiefs of staff, there's an opportunity to look at how a team is perceived as a leader. So you have annual State of the City addresses, but those are also occasions to assess a team. In other words, how is the mayor perceived as a leader? How is the team perceived as a leader? And I believe like the 911 systems can allow you to do that. So in other words, you can get real-time snapshots of perceptions of leadership as an executive team as opposed to, in other words, you have a better arc in terms of assessment and a bigger, more detailed picture of leadership in terms of group rather than individual. So any plans to do that?
I didn't follow what you meant by 911.
So there are these systems where citizens can like
311.
I'm sorry.
Oh, 311.
Yeah. Yeah. So citizens can kind of report on what they think of the city and what they think of the team. So anyway, is that something that
Do you want to speak to that one?
Yeah, so we have a whole separate leadership development track for senior leaders. So each mayor gets to nominate 2 senior leaders, like the chief of staff or the budget director and community development director, and they get a separate track, which is also 1 year long. And so the purpose of that is to make sure that there's a shared language between the mayor and the senior leaders. And the reason that's important is that, public narrative, as Marshall would say, is not about communication. It's not about speeching. It is about building relationships. And so those relationships themselves can provide the resources to get more work done and more people involved. And so that is a team effort. So you don't want the mayor to be on the bully pulpit and just speeching away. You want the senior leaders to get what it is that, what the values are that this administration is rooted in, and what the relations are that will help co-produce public value. So we haven't done as much on public narrative with the senior leaders as we did with the mayors, because there's other curricular items, of course, but many of the mayors that have done the workshop with Marshall have also kind of engaged their senior leaders in a public narrative, kind of self-made workshop in their cities.
Well, the last 2 weeks we had in Albuquerque with city staff, by the mayor, because they want to do this one Albuquerque thing, but they weren't even on anything within the city. And then we had in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which was amazing in terms of that. And the contrast, Albuquerque, all this diversity. Sioux Falls, everybody's white. And our coaching team is very diverse, and our examples are very problematic. And it's, if anything, more powerful than Second City than the first. It's really, so there's constant. The other thing is that we created this peer coaching group of the mayors. Those who want to do this about 18 or 20, and we meet with them online for peer coaching. So they'll come with their story of self, and then they'll get coaching from the other mayors. put them in small groups. We have our team see what's going on, and we take them through this over a period of about 3 months. And of course, those folks tend to be really into it. But I think the point about it's a form of relational leadership. It's not performative leadership that we're trying to get at. And so, yeah, they use it within the city. Within their own staff, not just out there to the
Yeah, follow-up. I think you were also talking about measuring this.
Yes.
So, I mean, that was the bottom line
Yeah,
of your
to
point.
measure the team.
And sometime in the future.
Yeah, right.
Keep that in mind, measuring the team, right?
Yeah,
That's what you-
That's
what you meant.
exactly right. Because it might be easier, but it also would be a more detailed picture in terms of the impact on the public perception. 4 years with a team as opposed to 4 years for an individual.
Yeah. We'll have to follow up with you on ideas for how we would do that and how we would deal with changes in the team and all that. But that is definitely a great idea.
I have a question, along the bit your question. Do you have data on the cultural or organizational context in which leadership has been defined well, better, or less well?
So we don't have data on that, no. We have theory on that from Marshall.
Or
But yeah, these are the beginnings.
Right, so, I mean, any kind of,
Well, trying it in Japan was a challenge.
right, I remember you told us for some study you were doing that the French were particularly resistant to receiving some of your treatment.
This was a Schwab workshop. There was a
Yeah, so I'm really concerned.
No, don't worry about that. No, our test was Japan because, the self is not exactly lifted up. And it was interesting because it took more engagement, but when they opened up, the energy that was released was just extraordinary. And they did.
Did you craft special tools or do you adapt your?
No, it's the same thing. It's just like, it's listening, it's going deep, it's learning how to ask questions and how to get people to examine their own experience. And that's been the same in every cultural context.
Do you correlate with countries or cultures where there are political parties like still powerful and big, and where they can actually socialize people to?
Well, we're actively involved in a project in Sweden right now with the Social Democrats. But this is not we're not gathering data on this. We're gathering experience like this.
So we will bring it to a close. We don't want to hold anyone hostage. And we look forward to conversations